Seattle recently passed new legislation that's going to set a minimum wage for drivers on rideshare platforms of Uber and Lyft. Now, we've seen a lot of conflicting research studies that tell us, a gauge of what these drivers have been earning in Seattle, anywhere from Berkeley's expected average earnings of just over $9 per hour to Cornell University's estimate of around $23 per hour. There is a wide spectrum of what people are actually saying that Uber and Lyft drivers are making in Seattle. A recent survey by the rideshare guy showed that Seattle was one of the top earning cities to drive in, but we continue to see more legislation and more pressure on different apps, different gig economy companies today, namely Lyft and Uber, to raise those minimum earnings. So let's take a look on what the implications are going to be for drivers, what this means, if there will be any restriction on flexibility, and what this means for passengers, if this will increase the cost of rides. But before we hop into that, I just want to make a quick little note. If you are looking to potentially make some more passive income investing, check out my new channel. I'm going to leave a link down below, and I basically just go through different stocks that I'm interested in and that I like to invest in. I like to hold these for a year or longer and basically sit back and try and pick the stocks that are going to end up leaving me with more money after a year of investing. It's a passion of mine, and I wanted to share that with you guys, so make sure to check it out if it's something that interests you. But let's dive back into this article. So the main Reuters article that I'm going to pull up talks a little bit more about this minimum wage, and essentially Seattle has a minimum wage for anyone that works at a company with more than 500 employees, and that's over $16.39 essentially is what you have to be paid in Seattle if you are working for one of these larger companies. So what they're kind of saying in here and what they're applying is that Lyft and Uber drivers are employees and they need to be getting that minimum wage. We've seen a lot of this sort of thing contested nationwide. In California with all gig workers in AB5. Seattle's pushing a lot. They did a lot during COVID-19 to push for premium pay, essentially giving drivers and workers an extra $2.50 per ride, per delivery, per shopping offer. So Seattle's been very progressive, and I will say that I do like to see drivers getting paid more. So hopefully this turns out to be a positive for drivers, and they end up actually netting more bank at the end of the day. So in order to gauge expectations of what Seattle drivers can be making after this new minimum wage law is passed, I decided to take a look at New York because they have already had this minimum wage law since 2018. And I found a nice study by insure.com that shows New York driver wages coming in at $80,000. Now that is before all of your different deductions, expenses are taken out, and there are a ton of expenses. So after those are all deducted, you're looking at closer to $45,000 per average Uber and a Lyft driver earnings in New York City. Now take this with a grain of salt because this is of course just one study, and we've seen just how much these studies can vary. But if you look at those results and you drill down a little bit further, you see that the average Uber driver is making about $25 per ride and giving about 2 rides per hour. And so that's a pretty decent wage right there. That's some very solid earnings, but you do, of course, have a lot of expenses chipping into those. The article mentioned that there's something like $5,000 that can be attributed to insurance every single year. There's license and permits, and there's taxes, all of the basic things that you're going to face wherever you drive for Uber. But these findings are nonetheless very optimistic and definitely good for drivers. I would not expect this new minimum wage to really decrease earnings, but we have yet to see what the unintended consequences are. Lyft and Uber sometimes present some scare tactics when stuff like this is passed to say that it will limit the freedom of drivers on the app and that it could take jobs away from drivers, especially when they need them most during an economic recovery. But I don't expect it to be that dramatic. There was, however, some interesting data shared by Lyft before this new legislation was passed, and essentially it showed that about 40% of all Lyft rides are taken in economically disadvantaged neighborhoods. So that means that if prices are to increase because of this new minimum wage, that you're going to see people who are already economically disadvantaged paying more for rides. So the real net value of this legislation, what does it do for poverty? Does it bring Uber drivers up out of poverty if they're making more? Potentially yes, but are you also raising the cost of living for other people in the city of Seattle because they now have to spend more on transportation costs? It's definitely an interesting perspective to consider, probably one that Seattle City Council did not consider much before passing this legislation. Honestly, I don't think they took a look at much of the data points. They kind of just have a mantra to push for worker protection, whatever it is, and they are going to advance that regardless of what the data says. That's not saying it's going to end up poorly for Seattle drivers. I do think it'll work out. I think it'll be a positive, but I think we need to look further at the data and continue to analyze it to see what other impacts it does have. If you drive for Lyft or Uber and you live in Seattle, let me know how much you're earning per ride, per hour, per week, per year, whatever it is. I'd love to get that data. As I mentioned, I live in Seattle, but I do not drive for either of these companies because my car is not new enough to do that. I do, however, work for some delivery apps, and I will say that most delivery drivers that I talk to are actually pretty satisfied with their earnings that they're getting from DoorDash, from Uber Eats, from Grubhub. So we'll see if legislation continues to push towards those delivery apps as well. And the same sort of idea follows here with delivery drivers. Everyone's an independent contractor, and that's why these surveys are so hard, because there is a wide spectrum of earnings. I mean, it's literally anywhere from with the Lyft and Uber drivers from $9 an hour to $40 an hour. That's a crazy range. Delivery drivers are similar. Some are just better at it. Some know the tips and tricks. Some are, good at just picking the right offers, and it ends up with a lot higher earnings. So you do see a lot of legislation pushing to balance that out. How will it really change for Lyft and Uber drivers has yet to be seen. One of the big parts of this legislation was that Seattle City Council wanted to guarantee that when you're cruising around looking for a ride, that you are guaranteed a certain minimum for that time, and that should equal out to helping you gain that minimum wage of $16.39 per hour, regardless of whether you're driving or not driving. That could limit drivers' time on the app. We could definitely see something there. So I will follow up with this video in the future and see what we are kind of getting as a result of this legislation here in Seattle.